The Montana sky stretched endlessly above Jackson Reeves as he rode along the eastern edge of his property. The summer heat beat down mercilessly, and dust clouds billowed behind his horse's hooves. At 45, Jackson's weathered face told the story of 2 decades spent working this unforgiving land. His once coal-black hair now streaked with silver at the temples. "Come on, Duster," he urged his chestnut quarter horse, sensing a storm brewing on the horizon. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, and he needed to check the fence line before heading back to the ranch house. As they approached the creek that marked his property's boundary with the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, Jackson noticed something unusual, a thin plume of smoke rising from a copse of cottonwoods. He guided Duster toward it, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured in his saddle holster. The scene that greeted him sent a chill through his body despite the summer heat. An overturned pickup truck lay partially submerged in the creek. The vehicle had clearly been there for hours, maybe overnight. Jackson dismounted quickly, his boots squelching in the mud as he approached. "Hello? Anyone there?" he called out, circling the wreckage cautiously. No response came, but as he peered inside the cab, he saw a man's body slumped over the steering wheel. The driver, a Native American man perhaps in his 30s, showed no signs of life. Jackson checked for a pulse anyway, finding none. The man had been dead for several hours. A soft whimper from the back seat made Jackson freeze. He pulled open the crumpled rear door to find a small boy, no more than 5 years old, huddled on the floor. The child's dark eyes were wide with fear, his small body trembling. "Hey there, buddy," Jackson said softly, crouching down. "Are you hurt?" The boy stared at him silently, clutching a small beaded medicine pouch. Jackson carefully helped the child out of the wreckage, checking him for injuries. Beyond some minor scrapes and bruises, he seemed physically unharmed. But the boy's vacant stare and silence spoke volumes about his emotional state. "Let's get you someplace safe," Jackson murmured, lifting the child onto Duster. The boy didn't resist, but kept his gaze fixed on the truck, on the man who would never wake up. The journey back to the ranch house took twice as long as usual. The boy remained silent, occasionally clutching Jackson's arm when Duster navigated uneven terrain. By the time they arrived, Sarah, Jackson's wife of 18 years, was waiting on the porch, concern etched across her face. "Jackson, what on earth?" Her words died as she saw the child. "Who is he? What happened?" While the boy sipped hot chocolate at their kitchen table, Jackson explained the situation in hushed tones. Sarah, a former nurse, had already checked the child for concussion or hidden injuries. "We need to call the sheriff," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And tribal police. This poor baby's family must be worried sick." Jackson nodded, but something made him hesitate as he looked at the child. The boy had finally fallen asleep on their couch, his small hand still clutching the medicine pouch. Sheriff Dan Holcomb arrived first, followed closely by Officer Ben Running Wolf from the tribal police. The men stood in Jackson's living room, speaking in low voices as they looked at the sleeping child. "His name is Charlie 2 Stars," Officer Running Wolf said after examining the medicine pouch and making some calls. "The driver was his father, Joseph. The boy's mother passed away last year from pneumonia." "Any other family?" Sarah asked, her hand protectively touching the boy's shoulder. Running Wolf shook his head. "Joseph was raising him alone. There's a grandmother, but she's in a nursing home in Billings. The tribal council will need to meet about his placement." Sheriff Holcomb nodded. "In the meantime, we'll need to take him into temporary state custody. There's a foster family in Miles City who can." "No," Jackson interrupted, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. "He stays here tonight. The boy's been through enough today." "Jackson," the sheriff began, "you know that's not procedure. The state has protocols for situations like this." "Look at him, Dan." Jackson gestured to the sleeping child. "You really want to wake him up and drag him off to strangers tonight? After what he's been through?" Sarah stepped forward. "We can keep him safe for a night. I'm a registered nurse, and we have plenty of space. Let the poor child sleep." After some discussion, the officers reluctantly agreed to let Charlie stay the night. with the understanding that representatives from the state's Child Protective Services and the Tribal Council would arrive the following morning to determine next steps. Neither Jackson nor Sarah slept much that night. They took turns checking on Charlie, who woke twice from nightmares, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Dawn broke with the promise of another scorching day. Jackson sat on the porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun rise over the eastern hills. Sarah joined him, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "He's still asleep," she said, accepting the cup Jackson poured for her from the thermos. Poor little guy was exhausted. Jackson nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Sarah, I've been thinking." She looked at him, recognizing the tone in his voice. It was the same one he'd used when he decided to take in 3 orphaned foals during last year's drought, or when he'd rebuilt the Wilsons' barn after the fire. "What are you thinking, Jackson?" "That boy in there has lost everything. His mother, now his father. He's all alone in the world." Sarah's hand found his. "Jackson, you can't just—" "Why not?" he asked, turning to face her. "We've got room. We've got love to give. Lord knows we tried for our own." The words hung between them, heavy with years of disappointment. Their inability to have children had been a wound that never fully healed. "It's not that simple," Sarah said softly. "There are laws, procedures, and he's a native child. There are specific protocols for placement of native children, to keep them connected to their heritage." "I know that," Jackson replied. "I'm not saying we should adopt him today. I'm saying maybe we could be his foster home while everything gets sorted out. Give him some stability. He already seems to trust us, at least a little." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. A state government car and a tribal council SUV kicked up dust as they drove up the long ranch road. Charlie had awakened and stood silently in the doorway, watching the cars approach with wary eyes. Sarah gently guided him back inside for breakfast, while Jackson went to meet their visitors. Ms. Diane Reynolds from Child Protective Services was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. With her was Thomas Blackfeather, a tribal elder and member of the Northern Cheyenne Council. "Mr. Reeves," Ms. Reynolds began after introductions, "we appreciate your assistance yesterday, but we'll be taking the child into state custody now. We have a licensed foster home ready to receive him." Jackson invited them inside, where Charlie sat at the kitchen table, picking at the pancakes Sarah had made. The boy glanced up as they entered, then quickly looked down again, his shoulders tensing. "Charlie," Thomas Blackfeather said gently in Cheyenne, before switching to English, "these people are here to help you." Charlie remained silent, his small fingers clutching the medicine pouch. "Mr. Blackfeather," Jackson said, choosing his words carefully, "Ms. Reynolds, my wife and I were wondering if Charlie could stay with us, at least temporarily. We have plenty of room, and it might be easier for him than another big change right now." Ms. Reynolds shook her head immediately. "That's not possible. You're not licensed foster parents, and there are specific requirements for placement of Native American children under the Indian Child Welfare Act. The ICWA does prioritize tribal placement," Thomas acknowledged, studying Jackson thoughtfully, "but it also prioritizes the child's well-being, which is precisely why he needs to be in a properly vetted environment," Ms. Reynolds insisted, opening her briefcase. "I have the necessary paperwork here. We should get moving before noon." Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Have you talked to his grandmother? Shouldn't she have some say in this?" Thomas nodded. "I spoke with Elizabeth Stars this morning. She's too ill to care for Charlie herself, but she expressed concern about him being placed far from the reservation." "Our ranch borders the reservation," Jackson pointed out. "Charlie could maintain connections with his community while staying with us." "That's not how this works, Mr. Reeves," Ms. Reynolds said firmly. "I understand you mean well, but you have no legal standing here. The boy will be coming with me today." Charlie, who had been listening silently, suddenly slipped from his chair and moved to stand beside Jackson, his small hand finding the cowboy's weathered one. Jackson looked down at the child, then back at the officials. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you take him today. Not like this." Not when he's clearly terrified. There must be a proper process, a transition plan. He's been through enough trauma. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Reynolds's voice took on a warning tone. Obstructing a child welfare officer is a serious offense. I'm not obstructing anything, Jackson replied calmly. I'm asking for time. Time for Charlie to adjust. Time for his grandmother to be consulted properly. Time for the tribal council to meet and make an informed decision. Thomas Blackfeather's expression was unreadable as his gaze moved between Jackson and Charlie. The council meets tomorrow, he said finally. Perhaps a one-day delay would allow for better transition planning. Word spread quickly across both the ranch community and the reservation. By nightfall, Jackson's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Calls from neighbors, friends, and people he barely knew, all expressing support for his stand. Sarah put Charlie to bed in their spare room, tucking him in with a stuffed horse that had been hers as a child. For the first time since his arrival, the boy spoke, just 2 words as she turned out the light. Thank you. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she gently closed the door and rejoined Jackson in the kitchen, where he sat with their neighbor, Mike Daniels. CPS doesn't back down easily, Mike warned, his voice low. Reynolds has a reputation for being by the book. She'll be back tomorrow with reinforcements, maybe even a court order. Jackson ran a hand through his hair. I'm not trying to break any laws. I just want what's best for that boy. The tribal council is split, Mike continued. Thomas Blackfeather called me. He's an old friend from when I taught on the reservation. Half the council supports your position, that Charlie should stay somewhere familiar until proper arrangements can be made. The other half is concerned about setting a precedent that might undermine the ICWA. Sarah touched Jackson's arm. What are we going to do if they come with a court order? Before Jackson could answer, his phone rang again. It was Ben Running Wolf, from the tribal police. Reeves, you've stirred up a hornet's nest, Running Wolf said without preamble. Reynolds has already requested a removal order from Judge Harrison. Jackson's heart sank. Harrison was known for siding with state agencies. Will he grant it? Probably by morning, Running Wolf replied. But here's the thing. Charlie's grandmother has been talking. She's respected in the community, and she's saying she wants the boy to stay with you until the council makes a formal decision. Does that help us legally? Not really, but it matters in other ways. Running Wolf paused. Just be ready for tomorrow. It might get complicated. After Mike left and Sarah finally went to bed, Jackson sat alone on the porch, watching the stars and contemplating the day ahead. He wasn't a man to defy the law, but something deep in his gut told him he was doing the right thing for Charlie. Morning came with an unusual sight. As Jackson stepped onto the porch with his coffee, he noticed dust clouds in the distance. Not 1 or 2 vehicles, but many, approaching from multiple directions. By the time the sun had fully risen, the scene before the ranch house was unlike anything Jackson had ever witnessed. Trucks, cars, and horses filled the property. People from the reservation stood shoulder to shoulder with ranchers, cowboys, and townspeople, at least 500 strong. Thomas Blackfeather walked up to the porch, his face solemn but his eyes bright. Elizabeth Two Stars asked us to come. She said no child of her blood should be taken by strangers when there are willing hearts nearby. Jackson was speechless as he surveyed the crowd. He recognized faces from both worlds he'd inhabited for 20 years, the ranching community and their neighbors from the reservation, groups that often kept to themselves, now united. A tribal elder he didn't know approached next, offering him a bundle of sweetgrass. For protection, the old man said. For the boy. Sarah joined him on the porch. Charlie held protectively in her arms. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of the gathered crowd. All these people came for me, he whispered, the most words he'd spoken since his arrival. They came because they care about what happens to you, Sarah explained gently. They want you to be safe and happy. At 10 o'clock precisely, 3 government vehicles pulled up to the property. Ms. Reynolds emerged from the first, her face tightening as she took in the scene. With her were 2 sheriff's deputies and a court officer holding papers. The crowd parted silently to allow them approach to the house, but reformed behind them, a clear message that they weren't leaving. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Reynolds called, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "I have a court order for the temporary custody of Charlie 2 Stars. Please bring the child forward immediately." Jackson stepped down from the porch, meeting her halfway. "May I see the order?" She handed him the document, which he read carefully before returning it. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his voice steady, "I respect the law and this order, but I also respect the wishes of Charlie's family and community." He gestured to the assembled crowd. "It seems they have something to say about this matter." Ms. Reynolds' lips formed a thin line as she surveyed the crowd. "This display of intimidation won't change the legal facts, Mr. Reeves. The court has ruled." "No one here is trying to intimidate anyone," Jackson replied calmly. "These people have come to show their support for Charlie's best interests. That's all." Sheriff Dan Holcomb pushed through the crowd, his expression troubled. "Diane," he addressed Ms. Reynolds, "maybe we should take a step back and talk this through. This situation doesn't need to escalate." "The law is clear, Sheriff," she responded, her voice clipped. "If Mr. Reeves refuses to comply with this court order, you are obligated to enforce it." The sheriff looked uncomfortable, his gaze moving between the government officials, Jackson, and the assembled community. Many of these people had elected him, had been his neighbors for decades. Thomas Blackfeather stepped forward. "If I may," he said, pulling a document from his pocket. "The tribal council held an emergency session at dawn. We've drafted a formal request for a 14-day stay on Charlie's placement, citing specific provisions of the Indian Child Welfare Act that allow the tribe time to evaluate placement options." Ms. Reynolds accepted the document with obvious reluctance. This should have gone through proper channels, through the court. "There wasn't time," Thomas replied, "and the welfare of one of our children couldn't wait for bureaucracy." As the officials huddled to discuss this new development, Sarah brought Charlie down from the porch. The boy stayed close to her side, but looked with curiosity at the tribal elders, who had gathered nearby. An elderly woman in a wheelchair was being helped through the crowd. Her silver hair was braided, and despite her frail appearance, her eyes were sharp and determined. "Grandmother," Charlie suddenly called out, the first real emotion in his voice since the accident. Elizabeth 2 Stars reached out gnarled hands to her grandson, who ran to her and climbed onto her lap. She spoke to him softly in Cheyenne, stroking his hair as he buried his face against her shoulder. The sight of their reunion sent a ripple through the crowd. Even Ms. Reynolds seemed affected, her rigid posture softening slightly. Elizabeth looked up, her gaze finding Jackson and Sarah. "Come," she said, her English accented but clear. They approached hesitantly, aware of all eyes upon them. "You took in my grandson when he needed shelter," she said. "You stood for him when others would take him away. For this, I thank you." Jackson knelt beside the wheelchair. "Ma'am, we just wanted to do right by him. We know how important it is that he stays connected to his heritage, to you, to his community." Elizabeth nodded. "I cannot care for him myself. My body fails me." She touched her chest. "But my heart is strong, and it tells me you are good people." She turned to Thomas Blackfeather. "The boy stays with these people for now, where I can see him often. This is my wish as his blood." Thomas looked between Elizabeth and Ms. Reynolds, who had approached to listen. "In our tradition, the wishes of elders, especially regarding their own family, carry great weight. The council will take Elizabeth's recommendation seriously in our formal determination." Ms. Reynolds consulted briefly with her colleagues before addressing the gathering. "I am willing to recommend a temporary stay on Charlie's placement for 7 days, pending further review. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves would need to file emergency foster parent paperwork today and meet with a home inspector by tomorrow." She turned directly to Jackson and Sarah. "This is highly irregular, and I want to be clear that there are no guarantees beyond the 7-day period." Sarah stepped forward. "We understand. We're willing to do whatever is necessary to provide Charlie with stability during this transition." The tension in the air began to dissipate. People started talking among themselves, the atmosphere shifting from confrontation to cautious celebration. Jackson found himself surrounded by neighbors and members of the tribal community, all offering support advice, and promises of help with the fostering process. Several ranchers' wives were already planning a supply drive to gather everything Charlie might need. By mid-afternoon, most of the crowd had dispersed, though many stayed behind to help set up a communal meal. Tables appeared as if by magic, laden with food brought by both ranching families and reservation residents. Charlie, who had been quiet and withdrawn since the accident, now moved cautiously among the people, occasionally answering questions or accepting small gifts. A carved wooden horse from one of the tribal elders, a child's cowboy hat from a neighboring rancher. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Jackson found a moment of quiet with Sarah. They watched as Charlie sat with his grandmother, listening intently as she told him a story, her hands moving expressively. "This is just the beginning," Sarah said softly. "We have a long road ahead." Jackson nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "But we're not walking it alone." The next 7 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Jackson and Sarah's ranch became a center of community collaboration as they worked to meet the requirements for emergency foster care certification. Home inspectors came and went. Safety modifications were installed by volunteer crews, childproof locks, a new railing on the porch steps, smoke detectors in every room. Background checks were expedited. Character references poured in from both the ranching community and tribal members. Charlie began to emerge from his shell, especially when Elizabeth visited daily. He followed Jackson around the ranch, watching intently as the cowboy went about his chores, occasionally asking quiet questions about the horses or cattle. On the third day, Charlie spoke his first full sentence to Jackson. "My dad had a horse," he said as they brushed down Duster in the early morning light. "Her name was Willow." Jackson paused, touched by this small confidence. "What color was she?" "White with gray spots, like clouds." "That sounds like a beautiful horse," Jackson replied, handing Charlie a smaller brush. "Would you like to learn how to take care of Duster?" Charlie nodded solemnly, and a fragile connection formed between them, a shared language of horses and care that required few words. With Sarah, Charlie was more reserved, but he accepted her gentle attention. She noticed he wouldn't eat until everyone at the table had been served, and he carefully folded his clothes each night before bed, habits that spoke of his father's loving guidance. On the afternoon of the 6th day, Thomas Blackfeather arrived with news. The tribal council had reached a decision. They would support Charlie's placement with the Reeves family under several conditions. Charlie would attend a reservation school when he reached school age. He would participate regularly in tribal cultural events, and Elizabeth would have unrestricted visitation rights. "We believe this arrangement honors both Charlie's needs and our responsibility to maintain his connection to his heritage," Thomas explained. "The council was impressed by your willingness to embrace these conditions." Jackson shook the man's hand. "We never wanted to separate Charlie from his culture or his family. We just wanted to give him a safe place to heal." That evening, as darkness fell, Sarah found Jackson sitting alone on the porch steps, his expression troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling beside him. "This is good news." "It is," he agreed. "But what if Ms. Reynolds and the state don't accept the council's recommendation? Tomorrow is the deadline." Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "We've done everything they asked. The home inspection went well. Our background checks are clear. We have the community's support and Elizabeth's blessing. What more could they want?" "Procedure," Jackson sighed. "They want their procedures followed, their boxes checked. And I understand that those procedures exist to protect children. But sometimes, what a child needs most doesn't fit neatly into bureaucratic categories." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional soft nickering from the horses in the barn. "He asked about his dad today," Sarah said quietly. "Wanted to know when we could visit his grave." Jackson nodded. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That once everything is settled, we'll take him there as often as he wants. That it's important to remember the people we love, even when it hurts." The 7th day dawned clear and hot. By 9 o'clock, Ms. Reynolds arrived with 2 colleagues. Her demeanor was professional, but notably less adversarial than during their previous encounters. We've reviewed your emergency foster care application, the home inspection reports, and the tribal council's recommendation. She began once they were seated in the living room. Charlie was outside with Elizabeth, both of them watching a pair of eagles circling above the distant hills. Normally, this process takes months, not days. Ms. Reynolds continued. But given the unique circumstances and the overwhelming community support, my department is willing to grant provisional approval for Charlie's placement here, with quarterly reviews for the first year. Relief washed over Jackson and Sarah, but Ms. Reynolds wasn't finished. I want to be clear, this is conditional approval. You'll need to complete the full foster parent training program, and Charlie will have regular visits with a state-appointed counselor to help him process his grief. Of course, Sarah agreed immediately. Whatever he needs. Ms. Reynolds' expression softened slightly. For what it's worth, Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, I'm not the enemy here. My job is to ensure children are placed in safe, appropriate environments. The way you went about this was unorthodox, to say the least. We understand, Jackson acknowledged, and we apologize for any difficulty we caused. We just couldn't bear to see Charlie traumatized further. After the paperwork was signed and Ms. Reynolds departed, Jackson and Sarah stood together on the porch, watching Charlie and his grandmother. The boy was showing Elizabeth a robin's nest he discovered in the old oak tree by the corral, his small face animated as he described the blue eggs inside. "This is just the beginning," Sarah said, echoing her words from days earlier. "There will be challenges ahead." Jackson nodded, his arm around her waist. "But we'll face them together, all of us." In the distance, dust clouds rose as riders approached, friends and neighbors coming to hear the news, to celebrate or console as needed. This time, Jackson welcomed the sight. What had begun as a standoff had transformed into something else entirely. A community united across cultural lines by their concern for one small boy. And Charlie, sensing something important had happened, looked up from his conversation with his grandmother. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, he smiled, a small, hesitant gesture, but one that carried the promise of healing.